Good evening, everyone. How fabulous it is to see a standing room only crowd here tonight. This is terrific. I'm Steve Hunnings, and I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas, and it is my pleasure on behalf of Adat Synagogue to welcome you to this evening. Let's have a round of applause first for Jason Fenton.
It's good to get clapped before I give my talk, just in case.
It reminds me of something that Winston Churchill once said, because during a particularly heated debate in his war cabinet during the Second World War, he looked at somebody who was challenging him and said, "Remember this, I'm right now fighting this war, but afterwards I shall write its history," as Jason has done as a Machalnik, and now bringing us this beautiful exhibit. When I think of the Machalniks, it reminds me of a quote of Chaim Weizmann, who said, "You don't have to be crazy to be a Zionist, but it certainly helps." And think about what the Machalniks did. First of all, there had been no standing Jewish army since the days of Bar Kokhba, 132 CE, other than the Zion Mule Corps and the Jewish Brigade, just these two little incidents in history. Think about the fact that people who came from different countries, if you came from the United States to fight in the 48 war, you were in violation of the Neutrality Act. You were subject to the revocation of your citizenship. You were subject to going to jail upon your return to your country. From the United Kingdom, from where Jason was from, he was essentially fighting a war against his own country because Ernest Bevin and Clement Attlee, the Foreign Secretary, and the Prime Minister of Britain were deadly opposed to the entire Zionist enterprise. Okay, essentially you forfeited your national birthright to go fight for Israel. If you managed to make it to Israel, as in the case with Jason, as a member of the anti-tank brigade in the Negev, you resorted to scavenging parts and equipment from the Egyptians. If you are Leon Frankel, our decorated World War II pilot, Navy Cross, Distinguished Flying Cross, you ended up flying a Messerschmitt, which was essentially a Rube Goldberg device, a fighter plane with a bomber engine, with all the risks that entailed. And if you're willing to assume all these risks, you then went to a country with essentially no standing army. You had a wonderful underground force, you had all the people resources in the world, but you had practically no military infrastructure to fight the invading armies of 5 Arab states, an irregular force within Palestine, any number of terrorists, and an arms embargo for most of the world. So these were all of your obstacles if you were a Machalik, a foreign volunteer who went to fight in the 1948 war. Many people, like Leon, or Bucky Buchanan from the Merchant Marine, or Red Sturry, who's since passed away, all fought in the Second World War. So not only were they willing to assume the risks of going to fight in essentially this foreign war, but they were all veterans of an earlier conflict, the Second World War. Jason, as the youngest Machalik, was not yet old enough to have served in the Second World War, yet he went as a 16-year-old boy to fight in the war. So think of all of these obstacles that these brave fighters assumed or encountered, and yet they went and did it. I've interviewed Leon, I've heard him interviewed, I've talked to him, and he says something as simple as, I knew it was the right thing to do, and I'm sure Jason will say the same thing about why he volunteered to go fight in the 1948 war. It's really an extraordinary story, and we owe a gigantic debt of gratitude to these Machaliks. People have to realize that the Yishuv, the pre-state Jewish population of Palestine, was 600,000 people. 6,000, or 1%, were killed in the 48 war. 122 Machaliks were killed in the 48 war. You can extrapolate for yourself what the casualties would have been for the United States in 1948 had they suffered deaths of 1% of our population. That tells you something about the magnitude of the conflict, how truly bitter and devastating it was. Yet at the end, it secured the birth of the state of Israel, and in no small part due to the combination of the Machaliks and the Sabras and the Palestinian Jews who fought this war to its successful conclusion. At the beginning of at least one of the editions of Jason's book, Jason discusses his name and the fact that over time it's changed a little bit, his name. But he mentions that his Hebrew name is Yehuda Lev Ben Zion. And I'll say this, that all of the Machaliks who went over in 1948 to fight essentially for the Jewish people and the Jewish state were sons and daughters of Zion. So with that, I invite everybody later to look at the exhibit. We'll soon hear from Jason. It's fantastic to see everyone that's here tonight, and I call upon my dear friend Heidi Schneider for some more words. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Steve. And I want to start out tonight by saying thank you to the many organizations that helped sponsor this event tonight. The Israel Center of the Minneapolis Jewish Federation, Adav Yeshurun, the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas, represented by Steve. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Minnesota's Against Terrorism, the Israel Marketplace by Made in Israel, the Jewish Christian Library and Center, Living Word Christian Center, and I especially want to personally thank Elad Harrell and Nina Samuels for all their hard work in making this evening a success and getting so many of you here tonight. And before I introduce our guest, the youngest Machalik, I just want to thank and recognize Leon Frankel, who is also with us tonight. We are so proud to have two heroes of the War of Independence with us. It's really a very special evening. Dr. Jason Fenton is in Minneapolis to celebrate the bar mitzvah of his grandson, Ronan Pink. And his daughters, his daughters, Tamar Fenton and Suzanne Fenton, are members of this congregation, as are their husbands, David Pink and Dan Lieberman. And besides this very important role as grandfather to Aiden and Asher, Ronan and Liel, Charles and Leo and Emmett, Dr. Fenton has also been a college professor, writer, and a lecturer on the history of Israel and the Middle East and contemporary issues in the region. He has written Strength and Courage, the untold story of the Machal volunteers who helped win Israel's War of Independence. It's a memoir of his service in the Israeli War of Independence, and it's also a historical account of the war and a personal tribute by Dr. Fenton to the men and women from the nations outside of Israel who volunteered their strength and their courage and sometimes their lives to help secure the new democratic Jewish state. After Dr. Fenton's presentation, we'll have about 20 minutes of questions from all of you to him. And I ask you to please join me in welcoming Dr. Fenton to our community.
I did have my speech up here.
Oh, I have. I want to see our
Now I know where you got all your information.
Well done.
No, without this, I'd be in real trouble, so thank you very much. I want to welcome all of you here. I see my family in the front row, and thank you so much for coming and joining me in today's activities and so on. Oh, you can't hear me? Oh, okay. Can you hear me back there? Hello, okay. So I want to welcome all of you here. Let me put my book out of the way. I'm going to tell you a story. Now, you've heard some of it a little earlier this evening. I'll try not to duplicate too much of what you've already heard, but I'd like you to tell you a story that you should find very interesting and even inspiring. Okay, my daughters are very helpful. Thank you, Susan.
Right in front.
I've kidded myself all these years that my voice carries without a microphone, but evidently it doesn't. Okay, so I want to tell you an interesting story, and even an inspiring story, on one of the best kept secrets of the War of Independence, the Machal volunteers. The 4,000 men and women, Jews and non-Jews, who came from mainly English-speaking countries, who left their families, their jobs, their universities, their studies, just about everything that they did, to fight for a country they had never been to, and to embark in a place whose language they did not speak. This is their story, and it's also my story because I was one of the volunteers. And let me also welcome Leon Frankel, a true hero of the War of Independence. Bucky Pequeno, who I understand is in Florida enjoying the sunshine. Also another Machalnik and so on. And this is my story, but it's also representative, I hope, of all the other 4,000 Machalniks who really gave up so much to fight for a country that, as I say, they had never seen and whose language they didn't speak. A little personal history, if I may. I am the son of an Orthodox rabbi. I got my name Yehuda Ben Sion because my father's name was Ben Sion, and I was Yehuda Lev, the son of Ben Sion, and so on. He was an Orthodox rabbi, but he was also an ardent Zionist. And this is where I got my initial kind of upbringing in believing that the Jews had a right to their own homeland, a Jewish state, after a 2,000-year exile. Both my parents died when they were in their very early 40s, and I was shipped off to a military-type boarding school in Cambridge, England. Okay? My new guardians welcomed the insurance money, but they didn't really welcome perhaps another addition to their family in their home, and I went off to boarding school. And actually, I wasn't sorry to do so. It was a very, very good school in Cambridge, and I welcomed the excellent education and the chances that it gave me, you know, to become educated and so on. In 1947, I'd been in the boarding school for at least 3 years, and I'd made, this modern generation doesn't know about crystal sets, but I built my own crystal set radio. And up in my bedroom, we weren't allowed to have radios in the boarding school anyway, but I had this little crystal set radio. And I listened to the BBC that was reporting in November 1947 the partition plan where they were going to divide, the United Nations were deciding to divide up this small Palestine, because 80% of Palestine had already been given to the Jordanians, which we should remember. And the rest of it, was going to be divided up into a Jewish state and an Arab state, 2 independent states. And if you really examine the history of the partition plan, it far from favored Israel. In point of fact, it really made for an independent Arab state with just about all the Arab territory that they were living in at the present time in Palestine would be their state. In point of fact, what was left for the Israelis, much of it was barren land. We lost Jerusalem as our holy capital. We lost at least 20 of our settlements in the partition plan. So it wasn't a wonderful plan for the Jews of Israel. But as we say, the Arabs, who never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, vehemently rejected a chance for their own homeland. They could have had a homeland now for 62 years, and they gave that up because if it meant having a Jewish homeland there, they were not going to tolerate it. Instead, they decided they would destroy the Jewish state and take over the entire country. So after the partition vote, the 6 Arab delegations, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen, stormed out of the UN threatening war and the annihilation of the Jews. Pakistan delegation followed suit. Now, just about everywhere, from London to America, even in Zurich, Switzerland, Jews danced in the streets to the amazement of the Gentile neighbors who looked on. We were all dancing the horror in the street when the vote partition plan was accepted that there would be 2 states, 1 Jewish and 1 Arab. But with our joy, we knew that when the 100,000 British troops left Palestine, this would be a prelude to all-out war. And the 1 million armed Arab, Arabs who lived in Palestine at that time were all very well armed and became a de facto military, unit, if you like, that attacked Jews all over Palestine, while the British who were still there just looked on and did nothing. And on Friday, May the 14th, 1948, some 400 Jews sat in the Tel Aviv Art Museum, the most secure building in Tel Aviv, where that great Zionist leader, David Ben-Gurion, announced the establishment of the Jewish state. But the reality on May 14th, 1948 was stark and grim. When Israel declared its independence, the Arab League Secretary, General Azam Pasha, declared a jihad, a holy war against the Jews. And I quote, "This will be a war of extermination, a momentous massacre which will be spoken of like the Mongolian massacres and the Crusades," unquote. The Mufti of Jerusalem, a great friend, buddy of Adolf Hitler, who actually lived in Germany during the war and helped him establish the Jewish solution. Hajj Amin al-Husseini, not to be outdone, stated, quote, "I declare a holy war, my Muslim brothers. Murder the Jews, murder them all." We need to know this history. These were not peace-loving folks that were going along with any kind of plan. They were determined to massacre the Jews of Palestine. And Damascus radio called on Arabs to, quote, "undertake the liberation battle that will tear the hearts from the body of the hateful Jews and trample them in the dust." And I'm not sure some of those attitudes, haven't remained the same over the last, 62, 65, 70 years, and so on. Now, the IDF today, the Israel Defense Forces today, when we think of the IDF, it's one of the most dedicated and powerful armies in the world, pound for pound. And most military analysts will tell you that the Israeli Top Gun pilots are probably the best in the world or close to it. But on May 15th, 1948, when the British mandate ended, was quite different. 5 very powerful, no matter what the Arabs tell you today, 5 very powerful Western-equipped Arab nations. They were equipped and trained by the Brits and by the French. The British trained the Egyptian army. They trained the Iraqi army. The French trained the Syrian army and the Lebanese army. And so Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, they had over 200,000 regular soldiers that were part of the invasion force, and many more thousands in reserve. And of course the 1 million local Arabs that were all armed, and all of them just about knew how to use rifles and guns from a very, very early age. They came fully equipped with 150 of the latest British, French, and Italian fighter aircraft and bombers. 350 modern tanks. Wait till I tell you what we had. And Leon, of course, knows what we had or didn't have as well. They had many long-range guns, plenty of bombs and ammunition, and an abundance of confidence. So much confidence that the Egyptians, certain of a quick victory, they figured 2 weeks at the most, actually printed a victory over Israel, a victory over the Zionist entity. They never mentioned Israel, even today they don't. Victory over the Zionist enemy postage stamp, even before they invaded. They had a victory stamp that they expected would be fulfilled in 2 weeks. So when the British lowered the flag and withdrew their troops and sailed away, the reality was that 600,000 Jewish farmers, accountants, shopkeepers, scholars, against 40 million plus militant Arabs bent on their destruction. And to make matters worse, many of you have been to Israel. It's a skinny little country. I mean, we love it, but it's a skinny little country today. And the borders were close to impossible to guard against. On 3 sides, it was surrounded by hostile enemies, and on the 4th side, by water. And this tiny, small, narrow strip of land, 7 to 12 miles wide between Hadera and Tel Aviv, and not much wider in many other places, with no place to withdraw to. It was not like the Russians in World War II could keep withdrawing and withdrawing as the Nazis, attacked and so on, and then recouped and then came back. There was no place to withdraw to. We got 7 miles of land, and that's about it. So this was a desperate situation facing the new state. Now, no one can question the bravery of the Israelis. But the facts are, there were very few Palestinian Jews. Some of them had volunteered and served in the British Army, in the Jewish Brigade, in the British Army towards the end of World War II. But very few Palestinian Jews had much experience fighting a conventional war against tanks, against long-range artillery, and modern warplanes. Guerrilla tactics and bravery, no question about it, but against a modern army with modern tanks and combat aircraft and powerful artillery, no. When Ben-Gurion, against the advice of friend and foe alike, announced Israel's independence, this wonderful hodgepodge of an army had no tanks. Now, I was there on the ground, so no one can tell me otherwise. We had no tanks in the very beginning, no military planes, no modern artillery. And to make matters worse, very few vehicles. We had 13,000 rifles for the defense of the entire country. 13,000. And you know what we had to do? When the fighting was in the north, we sent our rifles north. And luckily, the Arabs weren't very united in what they were doing. So when the Lebanese and the Syrians and the Iraqis attacked from the north, we sent our rifles to the north. And when the Egyptians attacked from the south, we sent our rifles back down to the south. That's how we tried to cover the war. 13,000 rifles for the entire defense of Israel. We had only enough ammunition in the beginning for 3 days of fighting. Let's think about that. Now, we did have a few single-engine planes, but these were mainly Piper Cubs. These little sport planes you see flying around even today. They weren't intended for combat, but undeterred, the Machal volunteer pilots in those beginning days bombed and strafed the enemy by firing machine guns through the open cockpit door, dropping hand grenades out of the cockpit door, and Molotov cocktails, and you might not believe this, empty seltzer bottles. Because you know what? The empty seltzer bottles, when they descended, howled like real bombs when they fell. And when the Egyptians heard this howling coming down, they scattered. They thought this was really something. Seltzer. Jewish seltzer bottles. This is an excerpt from my book, Strength and Courage, about the volunteers and how we had to improvise against a well-armed enemy. No one knew his right name. They called him the Mad Russian. Every night just before sundown, he climbed into an old Piper Cub and flew up towards Gaza. In his lap were 24 hand grenades, and in the rear seat, a burlap bag filled with empty bottles. Those are our seltzer bottles. He dived down to treetop level and hurled the grenades at the Egyptian troops. After exhausting the grenades, he would reach behind him for the burlap bag and bombard the enemy with the empty bottles. And one day he did not return. And then let me tell you about the bomb chucker-outers, which I'm sure Leo knows all about this, of course. When we finally, acquired a few larger war surplus transport planes, C-46s and some other so forth, we took the strongest guys we could find, and we would strap them in by the open cockpit door, because if you didn't strap them in, the slipstream would drag them out, and we almost lost one of our colleagues who was being pulled out of the plane. We strapped them in, so the slipstream wouldn't drag them out, put a 50-pound bomb on their laps, and they were called our bomb chucker-outers. And when the pilot said, bombs chuck out, that's exactly what he would do. Strapped in, that's how we fought the war in those beginning days. It was incredible that we did as well as we did. But now, by the beginning of 1948, the Haganah, and to a lesser extent the Irgun, started to recruit Jewish ex-servicemen in most major, communities in the West. Here in America, in Canada, in my country of Britain, and other Western countries and so on. So they could take part in the coming war. Now, as was already mentioned, the Brits were completely anti-Israel and the idea of a Jewish state. We had Ernest Bevin, who was an absolute anti-Semite and hated Jews and hated the idea of Israel. You would go to jail in England if you were involved in this, in supporting Israel in any possible fashion. And the United States, I believe you could even lose your citizenship if you fought in a foreign war. So it was very, very difficult for the Machal volunteers. They had to keep things very, very quiet and very, very secret, so they wouldn't, be arrested and have all these, and some of them were arrested. We had some of our folks arrested, and I'll talk about it perhaps later on. Some of those who raised money and smuggled guns and ammunition, the American heroes of Israel, some went to jail, and some, were severely punished, and then amnesty was provided later on. So I got back from Cambridge for the summer holidays in June of 1948, and I was trying to see what happened to my brother, elder brother Ivor. He disappeared. And just by question and answer, I figured that somehow he got involved with this recruitment process the Haganah had sent, to all these Western countries to recruit ex-servicemen. And I believe that he had been recruited and had started making his way to Israel. And I decided, and it sounds ridiculous now, the 16-year-old kid who was still in high school, that I would go also and do my bit. And my sister worked for Hapoel HaMizrahi, a religious Zionist organization. And when I went to visit her, I noticed that there were a lot of very young, very suntanned young fellows with very strange accents. This was Haganah recruiters that were visiting and you know, trying to find out people who had this kind of military background like Leon had that could be of great service, you know, to the, you know, incipient Jewish army that was being developed. I made a total pest of myself, and these people said to me, you know, there's nothing going on. You know, it was quite illegal. They couldn't admit anything. Said, there's nothing going on. We're not recruiting anybody, and don't say we are. And by the way, you're too young anyway. You know, but I made a pest of myself, as I said, and turns out there was a big recruitment center. Have any of you been to England? Oh, okay. You know about Marks and Spencer's? A marvelous store, if you ever go to England, Marks and Spencer's. And Marks and Spencer's, they're all over the place, a famous English chain of stores, and they were owned by Israel Seif, an ardent Zionist, a great friend of Chaim Weizmann. At the very top of the head office of Marks and Spencer's, they had recruiters there. And I was sent to be interviewed there, and you can just imagine, this 16-year-old kid who looked more like 14, I didn't shave yet, I'd come from one of these, quote, you know, public schools, which are private schools, so I spoke in a rather la-di-da British accent, and here I'm saying, yes, I want to go to Israel to fight. And they were kind of somewhat suspicious of me altogether, and they interviewed me, they wanted to know my background, and then I kind of let them know that, yeah, my dad was an Orthodox rabbi, and I knew a fair amount of Jewish history, and I could read Hebrew, and so, you know, I guess I passed muster. But I also told the recruiter, and this will make Leon smile, I told them that I was a pilot. Okay. Okay. There's nothing more chutzpah than a 60-year-old, you know, okay, chutzpah. The fact is, in my boarding school, I belonged to the Air Training Corps that trained people to fly planes. And we flew with the Cambridge University pilots. And so indeed, you know, every week I would go out to the flying field where the Cambridge University pilots were as part of the Air Training Corps, and we flew these Tiger Moth World War I trainers. Terrible plane, by wings, you know, made of canvas, but I learned to fly, okay? How well is another story, but I did learn to fly, and I thought, yeah, listen, I'll go to Israel and help out and be a pilot. At 16, you imagine amazing things. In point of fact, it turns out that Israel had 2 Tiger Moth trainers in its arsenal of aircraft. So they think, well, this guy says he can fly a Tiger Moth, we'll give him a chance. Then I got a little page, green paper, I still remember it, like a couple of lines, report to Willesden Green Synagogue. It's a suburb of London. And there they had put together this synagogue between, I guess, Shacharis and Mincha, when there was nobody there, except the people that had to be there. They had doctors and nurses that had served in World War II. And they, you know, gave us total medicals, gave us shots for every single illness, real and imagined, that we might face in the Middle East and so on. And then they also gave us where we would have to report in France, in Paris. And it was on the Avenue de la Grande Armée. We got a one-way ticket to Paris, and I had to report, and by the way, I had to tear up and destroy the address in Paris, which is on the Avenue de la Grande Armée. If you know French, it means the Avenue of the Great Grand Army, which I thought was very apt, since this was all about Israel and the Grand Army we were trying to create. So I tore up the address, I got my contact in Paris, and then I got the next stage of the underground, a one-way ticket to Marseille, where we had a refugee camp, a DP camp, where refugees from the Nazi Holocaust, the survivors, were there because they wanted to go to Israel too, and this was the only country that would take them. And the Machal volunteers who came in and shared rooms and shared time and so on, while we waited for those old decrepit boats that would transport us to Israel, like 10, 11, 12 day journey in terrible conditions, in very overcrowded boats, with very little food and very little water, and so on. And during this time, while we waited, we underwent Haganah training so that we would be more prepared when we got to Israel. So the great adventure had begun when I got to Marseille and the DP camp, and there was no turning back. I was committed to do what I had to do. However, and I'm going to say that luckily, for the future of this Machalnik and of the Israel Air Force, that my brother kind of intervened. My brother did get to Israel, evidently, I was correct. And when I got to Israel, I was at this Teledvinsky transit camp, and I tried to find out where my brother might be. And I have a cousin who was in the Israeli government, and he said, "Oh, you better sit down. Your brother has been very badly wounded, and he's in hospital right now. Would you like me to come over and drive you?" I said, "Well, which hospital?" "Teledvinsky." My brother was just 200 yards up the road from where I had been at Teledvinsky transit camp, and unbeknownst to me. And so, I went up to see him, and by the way, my brother, it turns out, I flew to Israel. They said, "Hey, pilot, we'll fly you in," right? My brother had to go on the slow trip, which was with one of these. He went in a 3-masted schooner, believe it or not. 3-masted schooner called the Marie Annick. And I'll just tell you this because it just struck me as kind of interesting. Did any of you see the Burt Lancaster movie, The Crimson Pirate? Anybody? Oh, it's one of my favorite movies. All my kids and family have seen it. Anyway, the Mary Annick, the boat that my brother, the schooner, 3-masted schooner, that my brother went to Israel on, it took like 14, 16 days of terrible conditions. It had, 600 people on it. It was really built for maybe 80. And this Marie Annick, they painted it a bilious shade of pink, and it became the boat used in The Crimson Pirate with Burt Lancaster. If you ever get the chance to see this movie, it's hilarious, it's marvelous, and when you look at that crimson painted boat, just think of my brother making that trip, to Israel and so on. So I was now in the Air Force, but I was waiting because we had a training program in Zatech, Czechoslovakia. We had arranged with Czechoslovakia to buy some of their Messerschmitt 109s, which was not exactly a Messerschmitt 109. It was a knockoff with, as you pointed out, a very underpowered engine, and it actually became almost like a death trap. It was called the Mule. It was such a bad airplane, and it was called, and some of our pilots called it the Nazi Revenge, because I would just say this, there was no synchronization between, the propeller and the machine guns, and a couple of our pilots shot off their own propellers, and they were always crash landing, and other horrible things. We had originally, I think, about 24 of them, and at least 18 basically crashed, couldn't take off, broke their landing gear. That was our first combat aircraft. But we were still glad to have them, because at least they got up in the air and let the Egyptians know that we could fight back if we had to. Anyway, I went to the base hospital, met my brother, told him I'm on my way to Czechoslovakia, waiting, to be released and so on. He wanted to know when I was staying, when I was going to be leaving for Czechoslovakia. He asked all kinds of details about my plans for the future in the Israeli Air Force. And he'd been very badly wounded. The bullet had come through his neck, machine gun bullet. He was in the battle for Fallujah, a very, very big battle that we had in the Negev. The bullet came into his neck, went down into his chest, and lodged very close to his heart. And they tried to take the bullet out under surgery, and it turned out his heart stopped, and they had to quit, and they just patched him up, and they were able to restart his heart again. And in fact, he told me later on that the surgeons wouldn't admit to him they hadn't taken the bullet out for at least like 2 weeks, because they were so scared that he was be so angry that the bullet's still there after all this. And by the way, the bullets is still embedded in his chest. And he walks, he's in London, and he walks through the airport. There are times when all the bells jangle because he's got this metal in his body. And I think he carries some kind of letter saying, I wasn't shot this week, you know, this is an old bullet wound, and so on and so forth. So I told him all my good news and so forth and so on. And it turns out that the next day, my brother's commanding officer, you know, came to visit him. And he told him the whole story that I'd left England without family permission, which was true, just took off. I didn't like taking orders, which was true then and is true now. I had no sense of direction, which is absolutely true, unless I am moderately drunk. And then I have a better sense of direction, but then I'm a very bad driver. And to top it all off, I clearly suffered from some kind of a death wish. Okay. And at 16, I was well under the age for military service, whether on the ground or in the air. And so I was told to report to the base commander's office to meet some visitors. And an unshaven American wearing army fatigues, a dirty black leather jacket, and of all things, a decrepit Brooklyn Dodgers baseball cap, introduced himself as my brother's commanding officer, Major Lester Gorham. And after some small talk, he said, grab your things, you're coming with us down to the Negev. Okay, because my brother had talked to him and convinced him that I was not safe to be left alone, so to speak. And I told him that no, I was in the Air Force, I was waiting for orders to go to Zatech in Czechoslovakia, and I was going to stay put until cleared for travel. At that moment, he kind of whistles out the window, and 5 of the grungiest-looking soldiers you could ever imagine came into the office. And you have to know, in the very beginning, we had handoff uniforms. I don't know where they got some of them from, but we didn't look like a really spit and polish military. Old uniforms, and every one of them was wearing a different hat. You know, you'd have to see those early pictures. Balaclavas, I mean, you couldn't imagine Australian bush hats, and they all came in, and they grabbed me, they found out where I was stationed, they grabbed my duffel bag, they threw it on a command car, and we raced past the sentry and went down to the base in the Negev, and I was now a member of the Democratic, very interesting unit, called the Democratic Anglo-Saxon 4th Troop, 1st Anti-Tank Regiment, to give it its full title, in a location in the Negev. Again, my life would never be the same, but I was less than thrilled. I really had hoped that perhaps I could fly for Israel and so on. But I'll just make the point, because of all we had pilots who went to Czechoslovakia for training. Some of them, like Leon, were real combat pilots who had experience either in the Navy, flying off aircraft carriers, or in the Air Force itself, and so on. Real flyers who also knew combat. Okay, but there were also private pilots, I guess, like myself, who had flown these little planes. Of all the private pilots who went down to Zatech for further training, every one of them failed. When they were shown this so-called Messerschmitt 109, none of them could fly this plane at all. It was even difficult for our very good pilots to fly this plane. So all the private pilots flunked out, and of course I would have too, no question about it. It's also been suggested, I've heard some suggest, that Machal volunteers were really a bunch of thrill-seeking mercenaries. Maybe there were 1 or 2 like that, but I have to tell you, nothing could really be further from the truth. My pay and the Machalnik's pay was about 6 lira a month. Well, about $6 a month. That's what we got for our pay for what we did. What could you buy for that? A couple of sandwiches if you were on leave, a candy bar or 2, some soda, and that's really about it. So mercenaries, no. Wanting excitement, perhaps that might be true in some cases. The majority of the volunteers were mostly World War II veterans with combat experience, whether as pilots or in the Navy or in the artillery or in the infantry and so on. And they brought with them an extensive military expertise that included familiarity with modern military equipment, knowledge of military command and control systems, and combat experience that proved vital for the newly formed Israeli Defense Forces. In fact, Machalniks served in every branch of the IDF, many in key positions of command. And I should say too, 200 of the Machal volunteers were doctors and nurses who served in hospitals near the front lines and in MASH units. And 425 Machal volunteers formed the new Israel Air Force and Air Transit Command. Made up of 90%, they made up 90% of the air crews. These were the volunteers who had the experience, and they formed the Air Force. They formed the air crews. And though it irritated some of the top brass, in the Israel Air Force, the War of Independence, the language of the pilots and the Air Force was by necessity English all through the War of Independence. Because that was the one language that the pilots and everybody else could use. So without fear of contradiction, I would say that Machal's contribution was ultimately decisive in helping Israel establish a professional army capable of winning its war against 5 powerful, equipped, and Western-trained armies. Now, when I got to Israel in '48, we were short of, as I said, we were short of all manner of weapons, including your basic rifle. During my first 2 weeks in combat, I had to borrow a rifle. I'm quite serious about this. I had to borrow a rifle from someone else in the unit to go out on patrol. And when I got back, he'd make sure that I returned it right back to him because he would need it himself. The very first rifle I got, I should tell you, when we finally got them flown in by our air training Machal pilots from Czechoslovakia, my rifle turned out to be a German Mauser rifle with a swastika on the stock. But I have to tell you, we were glad to have them. Not having a rifle and having a German Mauser, you still go for the German Mauser and try to scratch off or paint over the Nazi swastika. Now, I was in an anti-tank unit. My unit's first anti-tank unit had a gun, and it was called Woody. Can you imagine why it was called Woody? It was made of wood. It wasn't really it looked like a gun. It was shaped like a gun. Someone in a wood shop had made it look like one of those small artillery weapons, and made of wood. And I tell you what we did. It's laughable, but during this early part of the war, we did what we could. We would take grenades, particularly at night, throw them in front of Woody, so there'd be an explosion and lightning, so to speak, in the hope that the Egyptians would think these were real guns that we were firing. We didn't fool them for a minute. They weren't stupid. They weren't dumb. We didn't have anything, so we fired Woody, and so on. In point of fact, eventually what we had to do is we had to go out, and along with the Palmach, we would say, hey, we heard about 2 British 6-pounders or 2 British 25-pounder artillery guns, really good weapons that the British provided to their Egyptian forces. And we would go with the Palmach to rehabilitate a couple of these good artillery guns and bring them back, learn how to use them, and turn them again against the enemy. And by the way, all these stories are in my book, so if you are interested, you can certainly read it, and on those panels too. Again, those of my generation and so forth know who General Montgomery was. He was the hero of the British victory in World War II over Rommel at El Alamein. And this great hero of the war, this field marshal, even more than a general, stated publicly the Jewish state would be wiped out in 2 weeks by the far larger, better equipped, trained Arab armies. And for a while in the beginning, it looked like he was exactly right. Israel needed a miracle. But as Ben-Gurion said at the time, a Jew who doesn't believe in miracles is not a realist. He said that. So I wrote it down. Okay. Now, clearly Israel was outgunned outmanned in those early days. But Israel did have one secret weapon. It wasn't an atom bomb. It was more powerful than any atom bomb. The Israelis called it Ebrera, no alternative. Put more starkly, it meant win or be wiped out. For if they lost, the state of Israel would cease to exist, probably forever, never to return. If the various Arab nations lost, hey, they would just withdraw, recoup, and attack again, as they did, and as they have been doing over all these years. But Israel wouldn't have a second chance. Now, the military love acronyms, and the Israelis are no exception. There was Zachal, that's a regular army, the IDF. There was Gachal, which was the conscripted immigrants who didn't know how to fire rifles and sometimes were thrown into battles like Latrun, which they really were not prepared for. And now Machal. And Machal are the initials from Mitnadvei Chutz La'aretz, the volunteers from Michutz, from outside of Israel. Although I have to tell you that our Israeli comrades were very happy to have us there to assist them, who welcomed us warmly, appreciative of our assistance, but they thought that we were all a little crazy in volunteering. Who volunteers to fight and maybe get killed? And that Machal really stood for Meshuganim, those crazy guys from outside of Israel. Now the Israelis and the Israeli army actually referred to us as Ha-Anglo-Saxon, the Anglo-Saxons. For me, a very strange term, considering that most of our parents and grandparents came from exactly the same places in Kiev and in the Ukraine and in Russia and in Poland that the Israeli grandparents came from. And the foreign volunteers had as much in common with upper crust Anglo-Saxon Brits as bagels and lox, pickled herring, and gefilte fish had with pheasant under glass, cucumber sandwiches, and English trifle. We were not Anglo-Saxons, we were Jews who came in solidarity with the Israeli Jews to help out the very best we could. Now, I have to tell you that because most of the volunteers couldn't speak Hebrew, at least adequately, and there had been some friendly fire casualties owing to language problems, the English-speaking volunteers, if you like the Anglo-Saxon, formed English-speaking units. My unit was all English-speaking. We had liaison with the Israeli brigade. We had an Israeli with us who would tell us what the brigade wanted us to do. But he would speak English and he would speak Hebrew. But the tragic death of the American Colonel Mickey Marcus, who I know you've all heard of, was shot by his own sentry. Now, in the beginning, the story was put out that he was fighting, to the death against superior Arab forces, etc., etc. But the truth was, he went out to take a leak, and he put on a white. He kind of put on his white sheet over him, I guess, to keep him warm or whatever. Walked out into the field, and then when he walked back, they had changed sentries from when he went out and when he came back. And here's this guy coming back who's got this white sheet over him, and the sentry, who was from North Africa, didn't speak Hebrew. Well, he may have spoken Hebrew. He didn't speak English at all, and he couldn't converse with Mickey Marcus. And he was challenged, and Mickey Marcus couldn't respond because we had. Let me just explain that we were given passwords, if you like, from the prophets. Typically Isaiah, because they were more difficult than probably any others. And this would confuse the enemy who didn't know our Bible. And so there would be so when you were challenged, you had to give part of this proverb from Isaiah or from Amos or from Hosea or whoever it was, and you better get it right. And he didn't remember the prophet's statement, and he was shot and killed. And we had to tell his wife that he was killed on duty, which he was, and a great man, he was a machalnik who lost his life. And these passwords that we had to memorize in Hebrew would change from day to day. And I have to tell you, there were times when I forgot what the password was. And only by shouting the only Hebrew I could remember at the time, which was Eifo Habet Shemush. Where's the loo? In case you don't know the Hebrew. Probably saved me from a similar fate. Yeah, you heard the ball go back and you did the best you could to kind of impress the sentry that you really were Jewish and part of their forces and not some Arab infiltrator and so on. Now, not speaking Hebrew gave one of our fighter pilots a very close call. Milton Rubenfeld, a former U.S. Navy pilot, and a Machal volunteer, and Asa Weitzman, who learned to fly a Spitfire in World War II. And so, former RAF pilot, and later, of course, the President of Israel, were attacking an Iraqi armored column near Netanya. When Rubenfeld's Czech Messerschmitt, because they were terrible planes, failed, and he had to bail out. And as he was forced to bail out, and as he's coming closer to the land, he sees a group of local kibbutzniks approaching him with pitchforks because their kibbutz had been bombed on an almost daily basis by an Egyptian pilot flying a Spitfire. Now, Spitfires don't quite look like Messerschmitt 109s, but to the kibbutzniks, the plane's a plane, and they didn't even know the Israelis had too much in the way of planes. So they were approaching him as he was about to hit the ground, and they looked kind of angry. Desperate times call for desperate solutions. So he shouted out the only Yiddish he knew. Shabbos, gefilte fish, Shabbos, gefilte fish. Now these sound like made-up stories, but they're not, believe me. I did my research and we knew exactly what was going on. And so he lived to fly another day. Yes?
We'd like to have some time for questions, so
Okay, well,
well,
let me just finish up, if you would, so that there's some kind of closure on this. Okay. It was immense privilege and honor to serve in these historic and momentous days of the War of Independence and determine whether Israel would or would not be a Jewish state, or whether we'd have to wait another 2,000 years. And now, as we celebrate statehood for another miraculous year, I can look back and tell you, we the volunteers owe Israel far more than Israel owes us. Golda Meir told us in 48 that we had to have a faith that a miracle would happen, and she was right. Every Hanukkah we say, in remembrance of those early Jewish Maccabees who defeated the more powerful Syrian army, and they saved the Jewish state on that occasion. Today's modern Israeli Maccabees say the Jewish state, in 1948. And we say, Nes Gadol Hayasham. A great miracle did happen there in 1948. And we, the Machal volunteers, can be justifiably proud, for we were part of that miracle. In Hebrew, we say, Ad Me'ah V'Esrim. May you live to be 120. When it comes to Israel, we need to say, may you live forever, plus 120. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Fenton, for this wonderful, and we could do this, I think, for another hour, don't you think? Hear more from him. But we have to end the evening at some point, and I want to have time for all of you to ask questions of Dr. Fenton. He will also be selling copies of his book, and so you can continue the enjoyment of this experience by reading Dr. Fenton's book. So I'd like to start out by asking you, Dr. Fenton, about, you mentioned that your father had been a big influence on you as a Zionist. And I know in your book you also talked about all the Zionist youth programs and organizations that you were involved in, and that they went from one side of the political spectrum to the other.
Yes.
And I'm just interested in knowing what made you, as a 16-year-old, such an ardent Zionist. Was it really your father's influence? I mean, I think of you as being in this English boarding school,
it doesn't seem like the right environment to become an ardent Zionist.
Okay, but I was an ardent Zionist before I went to the boarding school, when my parents were alive, and, you know, there's political Zionism and there's also religious Zionism. We've been saying for 2,000 years, next year in Jerusalem, every Pesach, every Passover, that's what we say, wanting to get back. And for all these years, in fact, Jews have lived in Israel and have never left. Many were exiled in the dispersion and so on. The Romans dispersed them, the Babylonians dispersed them. But there have been Jews living in Israel, particularly in the Golan and the Galilee, who never left, who've always been there. And the Jews, very often religious Jews, have gone back, and my family, the religious Jews of my family, all went to Israel in their senior year. They didn't go to a senior living home here. They went to Israel to spend their last years there, and so on. I belong to Habonim. As I came through here, I saw Habonim on one of the doors. You have a Habonim group here. The builders. I belong to B'nai Akiva, which was a religious Zionist organization, like my sister, Hapoel HaMizrahi. And I also belong to, you know, I guess a more, well, other groups do, Hashomer HaTzair and so on. It didn't seem to matter to me. I used to go to camps, Habonim camp, a B'nai Akiva camp, where we learned about Hakshara, how to go and dig trenches and plant things. So it was part of my life, and going to boarding school didn't change that. Yeah.
One of the things you mentioned in your book, if I remember this correctly, is that many of the commanders actually used the Bible as a resource for finding surreptitious routes for military excursions. Can you talk more about that?
Well, yes. When we talk about military commanders, these were not only military commanders. In some cases, these were archaeologists who spent their lives studying the archaeology of Israel in that area, who knew their Bible inside and out. And in fact, my second cousin through marriage, Chaim Herzog, who was the son of the chief rabbi of Israel, he discovered the Burma Road, which was the road that we then built, you know, to get food into Jerusalem when Latrun cut off the supply line from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So, and he also wrote books, Chaim Herzog, about Israel, about the war. His father was the chief rabbi of Israel. They knew their archaeology, they knew their territory, and they knew their Bible. And they knew about Roman roads that the Romans had used to come in. In fact, when we captured, I was in the Battle of Uj el-Afir, and one of the archaeologists knew that there was a Roman road. So instead of attacking from Beersheba going south where we were expecting, and the Egyptians had all their guns trained north, expecting our attack from Beersheba coming south, he had our troops coming the back way, through the back door down this Roman road, and they laid down, tank meshing and so on, so our heavy, tanks, we had 3. And some of our armored vehicles, which were homemade in Israel. They took trucks and they made armored cars out of them, regular American trucks. And so the troops came up behind the Egyptians. They couldn't swing their guns around. They were dug in facing that way, and they couldn't fire at us because the troops came in from behind. This was the genius of these generals and archaeologists, and we needed all the help we could get because we didn't have the weaponry, but we had the seichel, and I think the seichel went out. Yes.
Are there other questions out here? Yes.
From what we've studied, Czechoslovakia was the first country that Hitler went into, and yet they were so instrumental in helping the early Zionists. Can you explain how that happened?
Well, that may be part of it too, that they weren't treated particularly well by the Nazis either. Secondly, a very practical thing too, they were really lacking in currency and in dollars and so forth. And these planes, these Messerschmitt 109s, which were really Avia 199s, this knockoff plane with a bad engine that was prone to crashing, nevertheless, they charged Israel a very high price for these planes, and also for the training program where they trained our pilots. So they got a lot of hard currency. But then the Brits and the Americans put tremendous pressure, and they forced the Czechs to close down. Because we had basically, you know, between Zatech, Czechoslovakia, and Telnov base in Israel, we were flying in all, my rifle came in this way, and one of our artillery guns came in this way. Without this airlift from Czechoslovakia to Telnov, we wouldn't have had the weapons to fight. But eventually, Britain and America and its allies told Czechoslovakia cease and desist. In fact, even the Russians were at that time were for the Czech helping us. Why? Because they thought Israel would become a communist state. You know, because, you know, in Israel, a lot of socialists, you know, and things like that, and they thought, and we hated Britain, of course, in Israel, and so they thought that they had an ally in Israel, so they were willing to support the Czechs in this, you know, in this transfer of arms across. But after a while, the Russians decided they didn't like what the Czechs were doing, and they executed the members of the Czech government and those that set up this air base, and they were executed by the Russians. So things did turn around. Yeah.
Yes.
Dr. Fenton, very wonderful part of history of the Jewish people. I'd like to just mention something I'm sure you're well, everybody here who's of a certain age remembers it. The Jewish people weren't given the state of Israel, or that they were given, the League of Nations gave the mandate to Great Britain for the entire land, and the Arabs got Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, when the Turkish
Right, the Ottoman Empire, yeah.
came apart.
Yeah.
And then the British got the mandate, and Chaim Weizmann discovered chemical that
TNT,
helped
right.
the World War I allies win the war.
Yes.
So the Jewish people didn't just got that, but they in turn deserve not only what is today Jordan, Judea, Samaria, and everything else. And the majority of Jewish people don't understand. They think the Balfour Declaration didn't exist, and they keep chopping and chopping and chopping. And the majority of Jewish people today in many organizations are pro-Palestinian, and I think this is a disgrace.
You know, I've taught at UCI out in Orange County, and I teach in the college in Orange County too. And it's true, many of the faculty are, some of them are extreme left-wing, pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel, anti-Zionist. At UC Irvine, where I taught, there was a horrible situation where Jewish students are almost scared to go on campus because of the virulent anti-Jewish, anti-Israel kind of sentiment that the faculty, and many of the faculty propagated. They're supposed to be teaching French, but they're also kind of putting in, let's ban food from and property that comes from Israel and so on. It's really a horrendous thing. But one of the reasons I give my talks, and I've got a Machal website, and that other people here do the very same thing, is to let people know the real facts, the real truth. And if you begin to know the facts and the truth, you can then discuss and debate and maybe convince some of these people of what really happened. You're absolutely right. The Balfour Declaration said there should be a Jewish homeland, and if you look at it, it was basically Jordan, Transjordan, and Palestine, absolutely, and including the Golan. And what the Brits did, because they had the mandate. Mandate means you take care of this area and you prepare it for self-statehood. That's what a mandate is. And the French had a mandate for Syria and Lebanon and so on. What the Brits did, they turned it into a colony for 30 years. A colony, their own colony, just like they had a colony in India and so on. And they treated the Jews very, very badly under their colonial rule. And they took basically at least 60% of the Jewish homeland and created for their buddy King Abdullah, who was kicked out of Arabia. They made him a country and it was called Transjordan, that was basically 60% of the Jewish homeland. So what was left was maybe this 40% or 30%, which was then cut in pieces, one for an Arab homeland and one for a Jewish homeland. The Arabs said, no, we won't have it if there's going to be a Jewish homeland. And the Jews said, hey, it's not perfect, it's got some real problems, but we'll take it because half a loaf is better than none. The Arabs could have had their own homeland for the last 62, 63 years had they had reasonable common sense. Yeah.
One of the misconceptions is that when the War of Independence broke out was the Jews who told the Arabs to get out of here.
Okay, we didn't. As I say, I was there, and we heard the radio broadcast, and we saw what was in the newspapers, and the Palestine Post, which was now the Jerusalem Post, which was an English newspaper. We pleaded with the Arabs in Haifa and in Jaffa, where there were large Arab communities. Please stay where you are. Everything is going to be fine. We did not ask them to leave. We really did not. We wanted them to stay, and we made statements to that effect and so on. But they expected the war to be over in a couple of weeks. And so the Arab powers that be, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, so on, Saudi Arabia, said, hey, look, you're in the way right now during the fighting. Move out, do what you have to do, and then you can come back and we'll have a great feast and party. You'll own all the things that the Jews had before and so on. And then some of the rich Arabs figured we don't want to be around during the war, and they went off to Lebanon. They had the money, they had the places they could live, and they decided they would wait out the war in a safe place. We did not kick them out, we really didn't. And we even asked them to stay.
In fact, they even dropped pamphlets.
Yeah.
Down the streets.
Yeah, and I heard the radio broadcast saying, please stay, particularly in Haifa and Jaffa. Yes, sir. Okay, please.
Yes, I was wondering your take on what's happening in Israel now. It's very frustrating to me, obviously, from what they went through, building the state and so on. And now you have a rising of the ultra-Orthodox who are trying to take over government, even to the point of saying, this isn't the real Israel.
Well,
I mean, it's crazy.
okay, this is nothing particularly new, and we've got to be careful when we say the Orthodox, because there's the Orthodox, there are also groups in Israel, the Neturei Karta, the Guardians of the Quarter in Old Jerusalem and so on. When I was in the Israeli army and we were going to Jerusalem to help try to save Old Jerusalem, some of these zealots, if you like, threw themselves in front of our trucks and jeeps and command cars and refused to get out of the way. And we told them that if you don't move, we're going to run over you. We're trying to save you, and we're saving both the religious Jews here and the secular Jews here, and we're in a war with an enemy that is trying to destroy us, and we're not going to let you kind of get in our way. So if you stay on the ground, and we started our vehicles, and these folks got up, cursed us and spat upon us, and we got through and we did what we had to do. But this is a very small minority of ultra-zealots. You can't condemn all Orthodox Jews for the actions of a few.
The statistic is like Missouri.com and so on, they are raising more and more people within their family. In a relatively few years, they will be the majority of Israel.
Well, look, I didn't come to here to talk about orthodoxy or non-orthodoxy.
Well, it's a situation that exists.
I don't want to pretend to be an authority on what's going on in Israel now. Some things we approve of, some things we have questions about. No country is perfect in this world. America isn't, and Israel isn't. We make our mistakes. Sometimes we remedy them wherever we can. I wanted to talk about the War of Independence and not get into religious versus non-religious attitudes. Yes?
Dr. Fenton, I think I'm going to close the questions. I have one more question for you, and if you have questions for Dr. Fenton, please come up and
been so patient.
Oh.
Yes, this gentleman has been waiting.
No, this boy here.
Oh, okay.
Yes, did you have a question?
So let's say you were in the army and you needed to go to Israel. Did they charge you or did they let you go on free?
Good question.
Can you repeat the
Yeah,
question?
the question was, you know, if you wanted to go to Israel, at least when I went, did they send you or did they let you go for free? In my case, they gave me one-way tickets, as I said, to get to Paris, and then from Paris to Marseille, and then onto these little boats, and in my case, onto one of these planes that flew me in. I should say, by the way, there's still Machal today. There's Machal 2000, where many young Jews who come out of Zionist organizations sign up to volunteer and spend 18 months or so in the Israeli army. And depending upon their fitness and health and what they want to do, they help out. And we also have volunteers. All my daughters did this. They volunteered and went to Israel, and they went to, let's say, where the tanks were, and they had to be cleaned, and so they would clean up all the tanks while the other guys would go on miluim, would go on leave, and so the volunteers came out and did a heck of a job, you know, allowing soldiers to go on leave while they took over their jobs, cleaned the tanks, cleaned the tank tracks, and did some very, very important things. So there were these volunteers and also Machal volunteers who are still arriving in Israel and doing a heck of a job. Young Jews who still believe in Israel and want to spend at least 18 months, a couple of years supporting Israel. And in some cases, deciding we're going to stay there.
I want to wrap up by saying that Dr. Fenton in his book talks about love stories. And not only about love stories about people from the state of Israel, but also romance that occurred between men and women, often from different countries, who found themselves together in this circumstance. I'll just do that as a teaser so you can get the book. But to wrap it up, I know you had a love interest of some sort. Well, you don't have to tell us more about that, but my question is...
Her name was Aura.
Aura. So many Machalniks returned. They did not end up staying in Israel. And it seemed to me that was one of the things I took away from the book. It seemed to me like more Machalniks might have stayed to see the development of the Jewish state. And you yourself, I don't think you returned home, but you didn't stay in Israel. And if you could just comment as a closing about what that decision was all about. I'm sure it wasn't an easy one.
Well, let me put the positive side. About 500 Machalniks either stayed in Israel when the war ended, or they went home and tidied up their affairs and then came back. So about 500. And today, those 500 now have sons and daughters and grandchildren who are all serving in the IDF. You know, so they're doing their duty, helping to help Israel defend itself against its many enemies and so on. And so there is a community there of Machalniks. But we were individuals who went. We didn't go as a kind of a union with power and authority. And so we had to survive the best way we could. When I was demobilized from the Israeli army, I had no job, no money, didn't speak very good Hebrew, and what was I going to do? I'd love to have stayed, but in my case, I decided, hey, I was now 17, I had to go back home to England and finish my education. And so I did. And then I met some young ladies from UCLA when I was in Paris for a while, and they said, hey, come to UCLA, come to America. Get your education here. And so I did. And I'm still here.
And now we're here for Ronan's bar mitzvah.
Exactly right. But all my kids have been to Israel, have loved it, have done their job as much as they could to help Israel continue on its wonderful progress. But that's part of the problem. We had no real strong organization to support us and find us jobs and find us work. And they did the best they could, but they had just recovered or tried to recover from a very difficult war. And they had all these refugees coming in from the death camps. They had a very tough job themselves. They did the best they could, but some of us would have liked to have stayed, but it just didn't work out for us.
I'm sorry that we can't take all the questions, but please feel free to talk to Dr. Fenton afterwards. I also invite you to stay and look at the exhibit that Dr. Fenton has so generously donated. It will be here at Adath for 1 month. And then it's going next to Bethel Synagogue, so you can see it there. And if any of you are representatives of organizations that might like to host this exhibit, we'd like to keep it here in the Twin Cities. Dr. Fenton is allowing us to keep it in the Twin Cities as long as we can find a place to hang it. So if you would like to take this to your institution for installation, you can talk to Eilat Harrell. You can also get Dr. Fenton's book. He will sign copies for you right now. I want to thank you, Dr. Fenton, for this really And I thank again all of our sponsors, and especially Eilat and Nina, and to the Adath Yeshurun staff who added half again as many chairs. I thank you all for coming tonight and learning together, and Mazel Tov to Ronan and the entire Fenton and Pink families on this special occasion.